tougher. I'm Steve Rooney. I'm the editor and publisher of Intelligent Vehicle Briefs. We've been around for about 6 years. We try to stay out ahead of what's going on and report sort of somewhere on the edge and about the current stuff. I am a transportation engineer, transportation systems engineer. I've worked all over the world. I did design with a team, design the transit system in Las Vegas. And that transit system won the best transit system in the U.S. award from the American Public Transit Association 2 years after we put it on the street. So that was pretty cool. So I've been doing sustainable transport for a long time. It's got a slightly different face now, I would say. And that's it. And this is Will Toor. Will, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, so Will Toor, I work as the executive director of the Colorado Energy Office. I've been there since 2019 when Governor Polis was elected governor. I joined the administration, I think it was January 17th, and I think it was January 18th that we were down at the Alliance Center where he was doing his first executive order on electrifying the transportation system. So it was like jumping right in. I think I'm best known, or at least the newspaper stories that I've been in that got the most reading were High Country News article about the time when I was 17 years old and some guys pulled a gun on me while I was hitchhiking and left me naked out on the road in Montana. So that's a good story to read.
Is that on your CV?
That's not on my CV. And then a couple of years ago, when my wife and I managed to fall off of a mountain in Rocky Mountain National Park, cornice collapsed while we were snow climbing and ended up getting airlifted out by the National Guard with a broken femur. Got to have a great conversation with the head of military affairs for the state, who I'd been arguing with for a couple of years about the impact of wind farms on the National Guard training. And I was like, I'm really glad that you guys are very well trained, but there's no way, now that I've seen them hovering next to a cliff while the wind is battering them, they can't go around a wind farm. But that said, so over the last almost 6 years now, I've been working at the Energy Office, helping to coordinate kind of the all of government approach on climate change and GHG mitigation and clean energy. Excuse me, the governor came in with a really big agenda on clean energy. When he was running, he had sort of four major points to his platform, and one of them was 100% clean electricity generation by 2040 and bold climate action. At the same time that he was elected, the legislature, for the first time in a number of years, was all Democratic and had a strong focus on climate action. So there was a sort of trifecta where the House, the Senate, and the governor, while we may sometimes disagree on how to get there, we're basically all aligned together on where we were trying to head. And it has led, I think, to a really exciting set of actions over the last 6 years. Colorado, I think, is kind of an unusual state. That when you think about the states that are leading on climate action, you often think of coastal states, the West Coast, or the very blue Northeast. Colorado is a more purplish state, middle of the country with a major oil and gas industry, so very different in terms of economy and demographics than many of the other states that have been very active on climate. But I think we've made really significant progress over the last number of years. And so that's what I'm going to talk about.
Okay, are we ready to roll?
I think we are.
Yeah.
So I'm going, like I said, going to talk about the pathway that Colorado was on for decarbonization. So if you go back to 2019, there were a number of things that were already in motion in the state. We, in 2014, had adopted the first methane rules for oil and gas emissions in the country that became the model for the federal rules on methane emissions. We had a renewable portfolio standard that the voters had put in place back in 2004 that had gradually been increased over time by the legislature. so had a 30% renewables by 2020 goal, but we really didn't have any comprehensive statewide climate policy. So in 2019, the administration worked with the legislature for the first time to set legislative goals for economy-wide GHG emissions reductions. They've since been updated a couple of times. Our targets now are to cut GHG emissions in half from a 2005 baseline by 2030 to be net zero by 2050. And when that legislation was passed, it was passed really based upon what are the sort of science-based targets for emissions reductions, not based upon an analysis of, well, what will it take to actually get there? So that was really what the governor charged the energy office with, was leading a multi-agency effort, working with both outside experts and a wide variety of stakeholders in the public to figure out, well, how the heck are we actually going to achieve these targets that we've set? And our primary focus through most of this has been on the 2030 targets. Even though we have targets for every 5 years through 2050, the way that we've approached it is that in order to make a real difference, you need enough time for things like major infrastructure investments to happen, major changes to the electric generation system. 2030 was far enough away that the actions that we took could really have an impact, but was close enough that we'd all still be alive and could be accountable for the decisions that we made. Whereas 2050, really easy to set goals for 2050 when nobody who's involved in setting those goals is going to be around to be responsible for them. So not that we don't keep our eye on 2050, but we've really tended to focus on that sort of medium-term goal. And there's a whole bunch of pieces that have come together to help make progress here. The philosophy that we've taken is to really try to focus in on the major emitting sectors. And in Colorado, there's really five things that count for the bulk of emissions. There's electricity generation, used to be the largest single source of emissions, although it's coming down. There's methane emissions associated with the oil and gas industry. While methane has a much shorter atmospheric lifetime, molecule for molecule, it has a much higher capture of outgoing infrared radiation, and so has a really significant impact at smaller volumes than CO2. There's transportation emissions that includes everything from aviation to individual cars. About 60% of it is coming from on-road cars, and right now about 25% from aviation. There's buildings and really the combustion of fuel in buildings. The electricity use in buildings we consider part of the electricity sector, and there's industrial emissions. And those are the 5 areas we've really focused on. There's also actually a significant set of emissions from agriculture, but because those are both less obvious in many ways what the strategies are for reducing those emissions, and it's an arena that is really not very amenable to a regulatory approach. Take a look at what happened in Europe over the last year with the tractor motorcades in European capitals. It's pretty clear that anything we do in agriculture really has to focus on sort of incentives and working with the industry. So we've focused primarily on those 5 major areas, and a number of pieces that we've put in place. So one on the regulatory side is a broad grant of authority to our state air commission, our Air Quality Control Commission, or AQCC, to adopt rules to make progress towards our goals. A strong focus on the electric side, and I would say, as with many other states, what we've concluded is that the core of our strategy is really about deep decarbonization of electricity, and then using that clean electricity to replace fossil fuel use in transportation and buildings and in at least a portion of industrial applications. And it's really enabled by the fact that Colorado has such a good wind resource and solar resource, and had a lot of old and expensive to operate coal plants so that you could essentially replace high-cost legacy coal plants with cheaper wind, solar, and to some extent batteries. And we put in place a set of regulatory requirements for our utilities to develop clean energy plans that would achieve at least an 80% emission reduction below 2005 levels by 2030. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that. We also put in place regulatory requirements on the oil and gas sector and on the industrial sector. On oil and gas, the requirement is at least 60% reduction in methane emissions by 2030. And there are really first in the nation rules that were put in place through our Air Commission that set a methane emission intensity target for the oil and gas industry, and it requires advanced monitoring to actually be able to tell are they actually reaching those intensity targets, and put in place a series of requirements on the industrial manufacturing sector. And there's a requirement of at least a 20% reduction from industrial manufacturing by 2030. And we have essentially 22 large manufacturing facilities in the state that have more than 25,000 tons a year of GHG emissions. They're pretty diverse. They range from well-known things like the Suncor refinery in Denver to we have the country's largest mozzarella plant in the Leprino mozzarella plant, and we have one of a handful of baking soda manufacturing facilities. Sort of a very diverse set of facilities across the state, as well as the whole midstream natural gas processing industry. And so for them, the primary focus has been regulatory, although we've also put in place a set of programs through our Industrial Clean Air Grant Program and competitive industrial decarbonization tax credits designed to incentivize voluntary emissions reductions beyond what they're required to do. I'll talk a bit more about that. It's been super interesting to see the kinds of projects that have come forward as we've stood it up over the last year and a half. We were kind of expecting to see what you might think of as more like vanilla energy efficiency projects. The first things we actually saw come through were actually industrial heat pumps, where people were replacing gas boilers with industrial heat pumps and looking at really deep reductions in the on-site emissions from some of those facilities. On the building side and transportation, it gets a little more complicated because we're no longer talking about a handful of electric utilities or a handful of industrial facilities. We're talking about all of us, like millions of individuals who own homes or rent homes or small business owners or have a car or figuring out how they're doing the transportation for their business. And very, very different. Can't focus nearly as much on just the regulatory side, has to focus much more on market transformation and how do we do a combination of regulations where they make sense, public investment where it makes sense, and incentives, whether it's grants or tax credits or whatever else, where that makes sense to achieve that market transformation. On the building side, just a couple of things that I would note. Really a first in the nation clean heat plan requirement, where for our gas distribution utilities, we set an emissions reduction goal, and they are required to develop plans to meet that goal. Those plans are then approved by our State Public Utilities Commission. And one of the plans has been approved to date by Xcel Energy. Their first plan covers the next 3 years. It's about $450 million of investment, largely in helping their customers switch from gas heating and water heating to the use of electric heat pumps. We also put in place a building performance standard requirement for large buildings that requires buildings over 50,000 square feet to track their energy use and emissions and to gradually reduce it. And for the first time, we have really pretty strong state minimum requirements for local government energy codes. So that include EV ready and electric ready requirements for new construction and major remodels. On the transportation side, which is probably what a lot of folks here are most interested in, we've really had a focus on widespread electrification of the both light duty vehicles and medium and heavy duty vehicles. And again, that's included this mixture of regulation, incentives, and investment. On the regulatory side, we've adopted the Advanced Clean Car Standard, requires that between now and 2032, manufacturers who are selling vehicles in Colorado have to sell a higher percentage each year of zero emission vehicles, basically electric or hydrogen. That grows to 82% by 2032. Advanced Clean Truck Standard, kind of a similar structure for medium and heavy duty vehicles. We also put in place a set of incentives to encourage people to buy those vehicles. Notably, the state tax credits. We have a $5,000 tax credit for EVs, including plug-in hybrids, an extra $2,500 incentive for low-cost EVs. So if the MSRP is under $35,000, I would note that the new Chevy Equinox EV is going to come in, I think it's $34,995. So we think that's partly because of that tax credit. I was just out with the governor today at Tynan's Nissan, where we were celebrating the fact that there have been lease deals for Nissan Leafs in Colorado as low as $19 a month, and that we have seen just huge increase in the sales of electric vehicles and leases of electric vehicles by Nissan since those deals went into place. Would note that when I started this job, the EV market share in Colorado was about 2.5%. As of the last full quarter of data that we have, second quarter of 2024, we were at 22.1%, and just got the September data from Atlas Public Policy. So we haven't, sometimes the data gets modified a little bit after we've had it for a few weeks and do some ground truthing. But for the first time, based on the preliminary data, September, we actually exceeded 25% market share of new vehicle sales in Colorado being EVs. So just a remarkable increase over the last 6 years. And then we...
Do you know what California is?
So I don't know what it is, over the last several months. The last time I saw numbers for California there was a California Energy Commission release bragging about them hitting 25% a couple months ago. But we're sort of closing in. Last I looked, we were number 3 in the nation. Basically, it was California, Washington State, and then Colorado. So we've really sort of moved up into that top tier. And then we know that a big piece of it is investment in charging infrastructure, that people need to know that there's going to be charging where they want to go. And for that, Colorado has really focused on creating some sustainable funding streams to support charging investment. As part of a broad transportation infrastructure bill in 2021, we created some transportation electrification enterprises that are funded by fees on like Amazon and FedEx deliveries, and Uber Lyft trips are the primary sources of funding. That's a growing revenue stream. It'll be about $75 million a year by the end of the decade. And it is paying for investments in EV charging infrastructure, as well as fleet incentives for medium heavy-duty vehicles, transportation network companies, and buses. And we're also working with the federal government, leveraging the federal National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure funds that came out of the Infrastructure Act, as well as utility dollars. We worked on legislation that requires our investor-owned utilities, the big one being Xcel Energy, to do transportation electrification plans that will invest in EV infrastructure to support widespread electrification. It was super interesting. working on both that legislation and then the actual cases before a Public Utilities Commission, because the first instinct that people have is, why are we spending utility dollars on helping out electric vehicles? Isn't that taking everybody's money to help a subset of people? But there's a lot of analysis out there, and it seems to be being proven out now that we've got a few years experience with the initial programs, that as we get more EVs on the road, because most EV charging is taking place at night when there's lots of excess capacity on the electric system, we're essentially taking fixed costs of the electric system and spreading them over more kilowatt hours, because you're paying more for that electricity in the middle of the night than it actually costs for the system to provide that electricity. So you're helping to cover those fixed costs. And the analysis that we have suggested every EV we put on the road over its lifetime reduces other people's electric bills, in total by about $650. And so, yes, we're putting utility dollars into supporting transportation electrification, but the net effect is actually to have downward pressure on everybody's electric rates. And it's significant investment that's being made. The most recent Excel plan over 3 years is about $270 million or $260 million of investment, largely in EV infrastructure, some of it in incentives for low-income people to acquire EVs. And then an emerging focus of the administration has really been on the vehicle miles traveled, transportation choice, giving people more options for walking, biking, public transit, and the whole land use connection, that we need to make it easier for people to live near where they work and near where they need to be on a daily basis, both because that makes everybody's lives better and helps to solve the biggest problem on Coloradans' minds when we do polling, which is the cost of living, which is primarily the cost of housing. But it also means that you're reducing how far people need to drive and making it easier for them to use other modes. And it's a sort of core part of our transportation strategy. And the governor has really led on a transportation land use reform agenda over the last couple of years. We started talking about 2.5 years ago. People were sort of terrified to talk about it. The first time we did a state agency sort of public paper on this, there was a lot of discussion among the agencies about, can we talk about some of the things that other states have done on the policy arena? And a lot of folks were, oh no, we can't talk about that. It's going to be too controversial. But the governor pretty much looked at it and said, oh no, not only are we going to talk about that stuff, we're going to do it all. And it all went into a really big land use reform package, Senate Bill 213 in 2023, that failed by one vote in the state Senate, but then it failed upwards, and it really changed the whole statewide conversation and led to 5 major pieces of land use reform that made it through the legislature this year, including 2 that were pretty much first in the nation. One is a requirement that for all of our cities that have a high-frequency public transit, they essentially have to zone to allow significant amounts of multifamily along those public transit corridors. And along those public transit corridors, it said that you could no longer set minimum parking requirements for residential development. And it turns out that those minimum parking requirements both add hundreds of dollars a month to rents along transit corridors because it's so expensive to provide the parking, but are also one of the major constraints on the ability to actually build housing. And so some really significant land use reform that's moved forward. Yeah.
Is that okay? Questions as we go?
However you want it.
Where is air travel calculated in all of this? Because obviously we're talking about different states or different geographies. Where do those emissions?
So those show up in the transportation sector. So they are in our GHG inventory in the transportation sector, but basically we don't have any real strategies to tackle them because so much of air transportation is essentially regulated at the federal level, and state state action is largely preempted by the Federal Aviation Administration. So you can do things like create some incentives for use of sustainable aviation fuel, but you can't require it. You're welcome. So just to give a sense of where do we think this is all taking us, based upon what we've put in place to date, and a set of new near-term actions that are essentially the game plan for the last couple of years of the Polis administration that we've committed to in our state greenhouse gas roadmap and are working on both through administrative action and legislation. That takes us to this sort of green trajectory, which is our projected greenhouse gas emissions going into the future. To give a sense, back in 2005, we were just a bit under 150 million tons. Our goal for 2030 is 75 million tons, basically half of that. And we think we're going to be within a couple percent of that. The strategies we have right now don't get us all the way there, but they get us pretty darn close. And as you can see, once you go out past 2030, there's a lot more that we're going to need to do if we're going to be headed towards net zero emissions. But we think that we're at least starting to bend the curve and put in place the strategies that we need to get going here. What time is it? How much?
You want to know what time?
Yeah, that would be great. Just
You are at, who's got the time?
It's 6:41.
Okay.
6:41.
Okay, so I'm going to skip through a lot of the slides, but
You're doing great.
okay.
We're fine.
Okay.
Anybody need to hurry?
No, we're
Okay.
doing well.
All right. So on the electricity front, this is, again, the place where we are seeing by far the most rapid transition. And it's a fairly remarkable transition when you think back to where Colorado was a couple of decades ago. So Colorado historically was one of the most coal-heavy states in the nation. You don't have to go back that far for it to be close to 70% of electricity coming from coal. Today we're at about half that, more like 35%. And by the end of the decade, every coal plant in the state will be retired. And unlike some places where you see kind of a one-to-one coal going down and gas generation going up, in Colorado, gas generation has been relatively steady. While there certainly has been some increase in gas generation, the vast majority of energy that was generated by coal is instead being generated by renewables. And we have this clean energy plan requirement of at least 80% reduction in emissions by 2030 below a 2005 baseline. What we're seeing in practice, based upon the electric resource plans that have been approved by our Public Utilities Commission or adopted by individual like municipalities or cooperative utilities and then accepted by our Public Utilities Commission, is that by and large the utilities are going to substantially exceed that goal. And this is a bit of a moving target because we keep having updated resource plans, but what we're seeing is that in each updated resource plan, the emissions go down. And based upon what we're seeing today, we think that we're probably going to end up averaging across all the utilities somewhere around 87% to 88% emissions reduction by the end of the decade. And remember, that's during a time period that there's been significant population growth, significant economic growth, and starting over the last several years, a real focus on electrification of transportation and buildings. So you have increasing load growth. There's lots of interesting questions as we look out into the future here, and don't have time to go into all of them, but a number of the things that we are thinking about. One is what do we do for the post-2030 policy structure? We did some modeling with the company Ascend Analytics last year, looking at what are different pathways to 2040, assuming a substantial amount of load growth, really aligned with our state targets for building and industrial and transportation electrification. It did not include what seems to have emerged since then in terms of the huge sort of push for data centers and AI, and so it's probably an undercount of potential load growth. We ended up with around 50% load growth by 2040, and some of our utilities are now saying they think they might see that by 2030. So this is a bit of an evolving picture, but nonetheless, what we saw was that the lowest cost pathway to meeting that projected load gets us to over 95% GHG reduction, essentially because wind and solar are so cheap that in Colorado, you can add a large amount of wind, solar, and batteries, maintaining your fleet of natural gas generation, so using your natural gas power plants to provide reliability, but because the wind and solar are essentially free to operate once you've built them, during the vast majority of the time, almost all of your electricity is coming from that wind, solar, or wind and solar that's been stored in batteries. And so what we saw in that modeling was that we still needed to maintain a fairly large network of gas plants, but that they would only be operated 2 or 3% of the time. They would only be providing 2 or 3% of the energy. There were times when you absolutely needed them in order to maintain reliability on the system, but the wind and solar were the workhorses of the system. If we want to get all the way to zero, we know that we need to replace that gas generation with zero carbon dispatchable generation that's available 24/7. And there's a number of potential technologies for that range from geothermal to hydrogen to advanced nuclear to gas with carbon capture. The one that we're probably most bullish on in the state right now is geothermal, because we think that it there's a really good geothermal resource in the state, and there's a lot of policy work going on in the state right now to support early geothermal development. But we're open to sort of really any clean, firm technology over time. One other piece that I would say is, I think, an emerging issue here is really around the cost of electricity. And it's that while the generation is relatively inexpensive, there's a lot of investment that's going to be needed in the electricity system. We're a state that's got a lot of wildfire risk. So just like you see in California right now, where there's billions of dollars having to be invested by utilities in reducing wildfire risk and reducing the risks to the transmission and distribution system from wildfire, we're likely going to have to do a lot of that. We have a very old distribution system, and as we have economic growth and as we electrify buildings and transportation, we're going to need a lot of investment in upgrading the distribution system. We likely need a lot of investment in upgrading our transmission system. If demand for electricity didn't grow, all of those costs would be spread over the same number of kilowatt hours, and we could see pretty significant rise in electricity costs over the next 30 years, which would both be bad for people's pocketbooks and our economy, but also would make it much harder to electrify transportation and buildings and industry, because it would mess with the economics. If we can instead have really robust growth in electricity demand and do that in an intelligent way where we're doing managed loads that don't add a lot of cost to the system, there's a potential that we can essentially eliminate most of that rate growth that is larger than the rate of inflation. So the whole electrification strategy that we need for reducing emissions, it turns out, is probably also going to be really important for people's pocketbooks. And this is something we're just starting to wrap our heads around and try to think through what the policy is around it. There's an interesting debate that's out there right now around things like data centers. Like, should we be supporting bringing data centers to Colorado, or should we be trying to stop bringing data centers to Colorado? Some people are arguing, we don't need that load. It's going to mess with our clean energy trajectory. But others are arguing, boy, if we're smart about attracting data centers, making sure they're powered by clean energy, making sure that they're located in places where we've got good transmission and good renewable resources and conserve them at relatively low cost, they could add a lot of load to the system in ways that will actually help reduce everybody else's electric rates. So that's going to be a really interesting issue to try to suss through and think through kind of who's right and who's wrong in that debate. And I think that that's going to be kind of an active area of discussion and exploration over the next couple of years. So I believe right now we're at about 40%. So it's about 35-ish coal, 25-ish gas, and about 40 renewable.
Pretty darn good compared to other states.
We're, yeah, and it'll be about 80% by it'll be about 80% by the end of the decade. So I talked about industrial, just a couple of extra additional things that I would say here. One is that a major area that we're looking at is what's the role of carbon capture and storage. As we've looked at the industrial sector, portions of it we think we can address through electrification, portions of it through like new processes, but there's some industrial emissions that likely will be very hard to mitigate. And we think that carbon capture could be an important part of addressing the industrial side. And so as part of that, we ran legislation a couple of years ago that took our Oil and Gas Conservation Commission, or oil and gas regulator, turned them into the Energy and Carbon Management Commission, and gave them regulatory authority over carbon capture, over certain parts of the hydrogen economy, and over deep geothermal. And we actually just did the deep geothermal rules this fall and are about to move forward on adopting the rules for carbon storage. And that's an arena that there's been some controversy about, but we're pretty convinced that it's an important tool to have in our toolbox. On the building side, again, not gonna run through everything here. I would say again that buildings are a really challenging area to work on. This is a place where there's a lot of wind in our sails from the federal government right now through the Inflation Reduction Act, and we've got about $500 million of federal investment coming in to support building decarbonization through the Solar for All program, rebate programs for electric appliances and building energy efficiency, and support for large building decarbonization through EPA grant, as well as some significant financing coming through the EPA greenhouse gas reduction fund created by the Inflation Reduction Act. I would say the federal agencies are moving incredibly quickly right now because they're highly motivated to get the dollars out before the end of the year, just in case there's a change in administration. And so we are seeing federal agencies move at a speed that you seldom see federal agencies move at. But it's really helpful to have the that wind at our sails. I would say one interesting piece here is that the state of Colorado was really very successful in getting EPA funding to support building decarbonization. The Energy Office got a $130 million climate pollution reduction grant, and then the Denver Regional Council of Governments got another $200 million grant. There were only 25 grants nationwide, and I think we were the only state where there were 2 grants that came in, so it was pretty gratifying to see that level of support. Transportation, again, I think a major focus for folks here. Again, we have a combination of the clean car and clean truck requirements, growing dedicated revenue streams that are sustainable over the long term for investment in charging infrastructure and vehicle purchase incentives, our tax credits that do gradually phase out over time. And I think an issue over the long term will be what do we do about those tax credits as the number of vehicles gets so large that the hit on the general fund from tax credits gets larger and larger, and then our requirements for utility investment. Well, I would say that the tax credits have been extended multiple times. I believe that they were originally created back in like 2011 when there weren't really any EVs. We extended them in 2013, extended them again in like 2019, and then increased and extended them in, it must have been 2023.
You're saying the feds did that?
No, the state tax credit. The state tax credit.
Yeah.
And so our state tax credit now phases out in 2028. And the theory there was that by 2028, there will both be more cost parity in terms of upfront cost, and that the federal Inflation Reduction Act tax credits, that by 2028, there would be enough of a domestic supply chain that there would be a reasonable number of electric vehicles that would be eligible for the full $7,500 tax credit. Exactly how that'll play out, we'll have to see. I wouldn't be surprised if there's another conversation around, do we have to do anything, additional on state EV tax credits? But for now, the legislation that's in place phases them out through 2028. And again, I talked about this, but we've seen this sort of remarkable increase in EV market share. And again, this starts, if I added 2 more quarters, you'd be moving up towards 25% there. Talked a bit about this in terms of the land use and transportation piece, but essentially what we see is that different housing policy has a huge impact not just on transportation emissions, but also on building emissions. That essentially, because when you're building more of your housing in cities near where the jobs are, you tend to have somewhat smaller units than you do when you're building suburban or exurban development. And you have a lot more units that are either townhomes, condos, or apartments with shared walls, where the energy efficiency is higher than if every unit has, its own exterior walls. And so there's really significant reductions in energy use and emissions just from having a change in housing policy that allows more of the housing to be built in our cities. This is also an interesting example, I think. This is from the city that I live in, Boulder, some analysis from a few years ago that looked at people who lived in the city, how much did they drive on a daily basis, people who lived and worked in the city versus people who lived outside the city and had to commute in. And not too surprisingly, there's a huge difference in how much people drive. People were driving 3 times as much if they had to commute than if they didn't have to commute. And so it's not just on the building side, but on the transportation side, those land use choices have a huge impact. I think I'm coming close to the end here because some of these slides are appendices. So just to give a sense of some of the pieces that we've been working on really over the last year, there was the land use legislation that I talked about, where I'd have to say I'm still pinching myself that all 5 of the major pieces of land use legislation this year passed. We did a major piece of legislation on the distribution system. Turns out that this is something nobody ever thinks about. Like, people think a lot about how are we going to get enough renewables on the system. People don't often think about how are we going to interconnect new load? Like, how are we going to have the utility connect your electric vehicle charger or your heat pump to the utility system? But this has emerged as a major obstacle to a lot of our climate goals. I can't tell you how many times the Energy Office has gotten calls where there's like a housing developer, I want to do this affordable housing project that's going to be 100% electric, and the utility is telling me, that's great, we could interconnect you in 2028, and because it's going to require a transformer upgrade, you're going to pay $4 million for that transformer upgrade. You know, that's, you can't really get where we need to go if that's the approach to transmission. We basically have, or to distribution, we basically have an approach on distribution planning that came during a 20-year period when there was almost no growth in electricity demand. So the utilities didn't need to plan for it. We're now in a world where we're using more electricity. We're going to be using a lot more electricity, and we need a distribution system planning structure in which utilities are doing things like buying transformers in advance and stockpiling transformers so they don't have to wait on the transformer supply chain to be able to do an upgrade, where they're actually not waiting for you to come and say, I need this upgrade to the distribution system, but are mapping and determining, okay, where are there going to be needs on the distribution system, and we're going to make that investment in advance rather than having somebody come to us and then taking a few years to be able to meet it. And we worked on a really complicated piece of legislation because it had to balance that need for advanced planning with protection of ratepayers and making sure utilities weren't spending more than they needed to because they can make a return off of that. So it was a pretty complicated thing to put together, but had a really major piece of distribution system planning legislation that moved forward this year. Really significant increases in state transit funding. The most fun part of that is that the really big increase in transit funding is coming from a new production fee on oil and gas production in the state. It was part of a resolution, sort of a negotiated resolution to a ballot stand down between environmental groups and the oil and gas industry, in which each were threatening to bring forward ballot measures that the other side hated. And as part of sort of keeping both measures off of the ballot, we ended up with a resolution that included this production fee. A lot of action on the federal funding side. Over the last year, we've been awarded nearly $160 million for Solar for All, $130 million for the climate pollution reduction grants, $57 million for EV charging. There's another $140 million coming for rebates for energy efficiency and electrification. Really excited to see the Excel Clean Heat Plan move forward. A really interesting one is the Tri-State Electric Resource Plan. Anybody here sort of dealt with Tri-State over the years? So Tri-State Generation and Transmission is one of the nation's larger generation and transmission cooperatives. They provide electricity for most of the rural electric utilities in Colorado, as well as it's really 4 states. I'm not sure why it's tri-state, but also in New Mexico, Nebraska, and I believe it's Kansas, although they also get power from Arizona. Tri-State historically was incredibly coal-heavy utility. In fact, in some ways, they were more like a vertically integrated coal company. They owned both coal generation and the coal mines. And their former CEO is sort of famous. Our former governor, Bill Ritter, tells the story of their CEO using the NRA line of, you'll pry my coal plants out of my cold dead hands. As it turns out, it didn't require that. All he had to do was retire. But in 2019, at the same period that Governor Polis was elected and Governor Lujan Grisham in New Mexico, and both states were starting to adopt really strong clean energy goals, the Tri-State Board of Directors made the decision to turn over their leadership and had their old director retire. They brought in a new guy, Dwayne Hiley, who had made his name helping bring solar power to the rural co-ops in Arkansas, who came in, and his first week on the job, came in to say, I want to talk about how I can help meet the governor's clean energy goals. And Tri-State, by the end of the year, had developed a responsible energy plan that included retiring every coal plant they had in New Mexico and Colorado before the end of the decade, switching to about 70% renewables by the end of the decade. But then the most remarkable thing is, environmental groups in Tri-State had been fighting for years, but Tri-State teamed up with the Sierra Club to design what is known as the New Era program, which is a $9.5 billion investment in the Inflation Reduction Act from the U.S. Department of Agriculture to help rural cooperatives retire coal and add clean energy. And it was really an idea that I think was born in the tri-state boardroom in these conversations with the Sierra Club that made it into the Inflation Reduction Act. And tri-state recently got an announcement from USDA that they are an awardee of New Era, as is United Power and Core Electric. So 3 different utilities in Colorado getting major influxes of funding from the New Era program. They're still finalizing the numbers, but collectively those are likely to be over $1 billion of investment in Colorado in clean energy. That is going to allow tri-state to get all the way to 89% emission reduction by the end of the decade. Just really remarkable progress that we've seen there that would have been sort of unbelievable if you knew the tri-state of 2018. It's just been a fascinating thing to watch, and sort of shows the difference that progressive leadership can make in an organization. And this will be my last slide, just to give a sense of some of the things that we're working on now, and as we look at both administrative and legislative action over the next year or two. Renewable energy siting, major focus of the administrations right now. So far, it's been working pretty well in Colorado. We haven't seen sort of local obstacles to siting be a systematic force that is slowing down the clean energy transition. But we're looking around the country and seeing how many places it has become a real issue. And when we look at the level of both wind and solar and transmission that is going to need to be built over the next 20 years, we need to ensure that we have a siting approach that encourages thoughtful siting and addressing real impacts, but that also ensures that we are able to, in a timely fashion, build out the renewable energy that we need. So that's a major focus. Thinking about 2040 clean energy standard and how do we move beyond our 2030 clean energy standard in the electric side. A lot of work still to do on these emerging technologies, geothermal, hydrogen, carbon capture, and direct air capture. I described the thinking that we're starting to have around how do we tie electrification and thoughtful siting of large loads to meeting our clean energy goals and helping to drive down electric rates. So a lot to think about there. Thinking about sustainability of programs, we've put in place a lot of programs with one-time federal funding or one-time state funding, huge influx of money from Inflation Reduction Act and Infrastructure Act. They learned from the ARA back in the Obama era, where a lot of things went away after a year or two. Most of these have at least a 5-year runtime, but around 2028, a lot of the funding is going to go away. So we're giving a lot of thought to which programs need to continue, how do we create sustainable revenue streams so that midway through the next governor's tenure, we don't see a real cliff in funding for clean energy. And then lots more to do in terms of the next steps on housing and land use and the next steps on investment in transit and bicycle pedestrian infrastructure. So that gives us sort of a quick overview of sort of the major areas that we're working on. Yep.